Hello, everyone. So today we have another session of our training course for FilmLight, and today I will cover the topic of rendering and deliverables. And today with me is again my colleague Bob, who will be there also to help answering questions. And yeah, so I think I have a lot of things to show. It's a lot of content for today, but I hope I keep it below 30 minutes. And I think let's get started immediately. Okay, for today's training, I'm not using FilmLight Look, but I'm using a full version of FilmLight because FilmLight Look is limited in the rendering capabilities. And I want today's training to be useful for all FilmLight users. I have a very simple timeline here, just 3 shots of our piano tuner project and a basic grade applied to them. And today we want to render them to 2 different formats. To get started with the render setup, we open the views, render view. Here note the keyboard shortcut for it. So on my Mac here it's Control R. And with that shortcut you can close and open the window, which can be quite handy. The render view looks a bit intimidating at start because it brings lots of powerful features with it. And so let's cover them one by one. Here at the top of the window, we can select which frames we want to render from our current scene. So the default is that we want to render all frames. This is also what we're going to do today. But if you want to render, for example, just a single shot, like here the second shot, I can deactivate that toggle here and then go to selected shots, and you can see now it's set the correct frame render range just for that shot, or if it should be the first and last one. So this can also be multiple frame ranges here, and there are also other options that we're not going to cover today, so let's leave that on all frames. The next row are the deliverable presets. So currently there's only one here in my scene. If you create a scene with one of the scene templates, then you will see a whole set of deliverable presets here already as a starting point, as suggestions from our side. But the idea is that you customize those or you build your own ones and then store them either as an individual deliverable here or as a new deliverable set. So there you can store a whole set of deliverables at once. But let's keep it simple today. So let's start with this one. So we want to render a ProRes 4x4. For the FilmLight Look users who can't render ProRes 4x4, you could choose an H.264 as a replacement file format for that. Here on the output type, we select what kind of file we want to render. So sequences are image sequences. We can render image sequences with audio files, single movie files, so this would be QuickTime, MXF, MP4, etc. And there's also a special type for DCPs and IMFs. So for our ProRes 4x4, I choose movies, video and audio because I also want to render audio with it. The next thing I select is the file type, and QuickTime is already the correct one in my case. Then I choose the codec. Here I go with ProRes 4x4. You can see several other ones also available. And for the color space tagging, I choose automatic. So here we can see what kind of color metadata FilmLight will store into the QuickTime header. So the primaries will be 709, EOTF gamma 24, and the matrix will also be 709. So this is something that you can always verify here. So let's move on to the next section, audio. Here we can add more options for audio. So first I choose my codec. In this case, let's use 16-bit PCM audio, sample rate, channels, pretty much self-explaining. So let's remove these options. Moving on to our next section here, and let's add all of the options as a starting point. The first parameter is the render format. We chose HD 1920 1080 here, which is also our working format of the scene. But more importantly, this should match ideally the viewing format of your cursor. Or if you're rendering to a different output format, my advice is always then match this format and your render color space and all the other options with your cursor settings, because then you can preview how the actual render will look like in your cursor. Because you can imagine your cursor as something similar to a render. But the cursor renders to the video output, and the render view will render into files, actually. But this is a very good practice that I recommend to everyone, is match your render settings in your cursor to check what is going to happen. In our case, it's straightforward. We are choosing the same render format and the same color space as our cursor. The resolution, I will not go into too much detail today, just ensure that it's set here to max quality, then we can get rid of that option. The render frame rate should always be untouched. In this case, we want to render including our grade, so we render all layers here. And let's get rid of that option as well. We don't want to apply a mask. So this is something that we could do. So if we wanted to mask it, then we could do that here. And as mentioned previously, verify your mask in the cursor settings. Bypass categories we don't need today, as well as true light. Burn in can be used to overlay, let me just do something here, to overlay metadata or time code, or to do some watermarking, but we don't need that today. So let's get rid of that option as well. The video LUT defines the full and legal level scaling. For ProRes, we should always use full to legal scale to bring the full levels from the BaseLight timeline to legal levels for the ProRes. All ProRes formats expect legal range. The YCBCR matrix we should leave on automatic if we don't have a specific case where we want to change that, or if you don't know what that is doing. Now we come to the metadata. So what kind of metadata will we embed into the QuickTime file? Here it suggests the shot time code. But in our case, where we render the full timeline into a single movie file, it makes more sense to choose the rec time code as a metadata. We don't need analysis. Also, cache is not so relevant for that render. And the other options here are defining what should happen if we have incomplete stacks or gaps in the timeline. The default is that the render fails, so we will get notified about that. But for crucial unattended renders, you can also select other options here, for example, to render black or checkerboard frames. And here finally, for QuickTimes, we have the option to make the QuickTime file a fast start movie. So that is helpful if you upload the file over the internet and people want to start playing it before the full file is transferred. So now we have defined all the technical parameters of the file, but we have to set the naming and folder structure of the renders. And so here now we will start to use a lot of variables. Don't get scared by that. It's not super complicated and a very powerful feature. So we didn't talk too much about containers yet, but the general recommendation is that the image container path is set to the root directory of the project. So in my case, the container is set to volumes XSSD BLV piano tuner. So that's the root directory of my project. And that's also what I recommend for you to do always with your container path. Set it to the root folder of the project. Then we can use that container here also for our render presets. So because then these render presets get reusable to all of your projects. So that's the powerful idea here. So inside our projects, we will do a new folder called render. So I just typed in render, then I slash Here on the bottom with first file, we can always check where the first file will be rendered to and how the name will be exactly. So now we can see here it will go to the Piano Tuner project folder and then create a folder labeled render. Okay, here we see another folder here behind with 1920 1080. So that is a historical thing in Baselight, and we call it the resolution directories. For our render, we don't need that, and we can turn that off here with that button. Okay, but we don't want to put the file into the render folder, so we want to organize our renders a little bit better. So let's say we create another subfolder then called ProRes. Okay, so all of our ProRes files should go into that folder. Now, how do we name the individual file? So I get rid of that text here and let's type in something. So I have prepared something in the scene settings metadata that I want to show you. So here in scene settings metadata tab, we can define certain metadata fields of our scene. And here for the title, for example, I typed in Piano Tuner Season 1, Episode 1. I'm just simulating a TV show here to make it easier for you to understand. So here we just need to remember it's in the title field where I put this metadata. And I want to use that for the name of my QuickTime. So how can I reuse that field? We always start with the percent character and then the metadata value that we want to use in curly brackets. So I type title here and note that all of these expressions are case sensitive. If I hit enter now, we can see, so now our QuickTime file would be called Piano Tuner Season 1, Episode 1. But what if we need to render it again on another day? So that's why let's add today's date as well to it. And there's an easy shortcut for that. For example, to use %ISO date, which will then add today's date in ISO format with dashes between year, month, and day. So that can also be handy. In between, we could put something else additionally, like ProRes, for example. And then maybe that's all because we also render with audio. Let's maybe add stereo or something on top. So now let's verify our file name here for the last time, and I think that looks good. So let's get to our second deliverable, which will be a little bit more complicated. So I'm duplicating that one here. And the second one I want to render are EXR pulls. And they should be in ACES linear AP0 color space and ungraded. So how do we set up something like this? So let's start at the top again. Instead of movies, we render sequences. I choose the OpenEXR file format. I can choose a compression type. So maybe I choose a lossy one today for that training thing. And now to the render format. So typically or often we don't want to render to a specific format here, but we want to render to the input format, which is of course possible here. And very important, the render color space should not be 2.4 gamma rec 7 or 9, but ACES linear AP0 in that case. So let's add all the options here back so that we don't miss something important. Resolution is still fine, render frame rate as well. Here, layer track in that case should not be all layers, but we want to render input only. So we don't want to bake our grading in that case into the plates. But it would also be possible, we could also render with the grading to ACES linear AP0 if we would choose all layers here. We don't need a mask, we don't want to use categories or true light. We don't need a burn in. The video LUT is very important. Basically for most image sequences should be no scale, so we want to render full range. And very importantly here for the metadata, we don't want to embed the timeline rec time code into the EXRs. We want to embed the shot timecode, shot tape name. And we use the render frame rate here also to embed as the FPS into the EXR. We don't need an analysis. We haven't used any kind of caching here in the timeline at the moment, but I just want to mention it. When we're rendering to a higher resolution than our working format, it is a good practice then always hitting disable cache. This will then skip explicit cache in the timeline and render to the highest quality. Incomplete stacks and gaps we leave on fail. Now to the naming. We want to do something different here. It definitely shouldn't go to the ProRes folder, so I'm doing a new folder labeled EXR. And probably inside that folder, we want to do another date folder. So for every batch of VFX shots that we want to deliver, we want to put them into a separate date folder. And in this case, let's imagine the VFX vendor wants a specific date format without the dashes. So that's also possible, but it's a little bit more manual. But there are lots of variables available here to use. So I can use %year, %month, %day. And you can see, and so now we have today's date, but without the dashes and in a manual way. So what kind of variables can we use for these boxes here? There's a very helpful question mark icon here. And so here you can see a lot of the values that you can use. The general rule is always use %, curly brackets, and the value that you want to use in between the curly brackets. So now we have a date folder, and within that date folder, we want to put every shot into an individual folder. And so how would we then label these folders for each shot? We could use, for example, maybe the tape name or the clip name. And at that point, it's a good idea to examine our metadata. So I open Shots View. And so here we can see, for example, the tape name, and we can see, okay, so this one is the shortened Alexa tape name. So for VFX pulls, it's probably a better idea to use the clip name instead. So the clip name looks good. So let's use this one. So I do add a new slash and type in %, curly brackets, clip, closing the brackets. And okay, let's get rid of our file name here to keep our first file a little bit simpler. And so now we can see the folder render, EXR, our date folder, and then a folder for each clip name. You could now think, okay, what happens if I have the same clip multiple times in the timeline and I want each one to go into a separate folder? There's also a way to achieve that. I usually use the event number for it. So I add %.4. So that is to pad it with 4 digits. And then curly brackets, event. And then maybe let's add an underscore in between. So now we can see the first shot will now go into 4-digit event number underscore clip name. And so if the same clip name is used multiple times, each one will go into a separate folder because the event number is changing per shot in the timeline. And that's also one of the big questions that people often have about rendering in Baselight. How do you ensure that every movie or every clip goes into a separate folder? The only thing that you need to ensure is that you have metadata here in the folder or file naming that is consistent per frames, but changing per shot. So then every new shot will be put into a new folder or file. So everything is based on these variables here. Okay, so these are nice folders. And so how do we label the individual files? So I guess we could also use the clip name for that. There's a shortcut for the clip name and for some commonly used variables, and that one is %P. So now we would see, okay, so now we have the clip name here. We could add a dot in between, and then we have the frame number. In other cases, it can make sense to use the original source file name. And then we would use either a %W or %lowercase w. In our case, %lowercase w works good because it removes any numbering and the file extension from the source file name, which helps if the source files are, for example, image sequences or a sequence of array raw files, for example. So yeah, file name here works equally as good as clip name in our example. Now the only thing that is left is that we want to fix the numbering of each shot. So the default currently is set to scene frame number. So that's not what we want in that case. So we would just set this to shot time code, for example. So then it will just use the time code of each shot converted to a frame number here. I think now we have set up everything in the right way for both of our deliverables. So, and both of them are also checked. So to disable or enable a deliverable, you can press that button here on the top. And in that regard, another suggestion from my side: before you hit the submit button, always check the amount of deliverables shown here and then verify, do I really want to render all of these? Is this maybe one too many selected here? So that's also a good best practice. If you're working in a facility with multiple FilmLight machines that are all connected in a FilmLight cloud, then you can select here on the bottom right the specific machine that should execute the render jobs. You don't have to render on your local machine. In my case, I will render it here on my laptop. So now I'm hitting submit render. I can label that render operation, but usually I just submit with the default title. So that operation title is now appearing here. We can see that it's currently in progress, the time that it has elapsed, and also which frame it is currently processing. If I click on that operation here, we can see both render commands. So it rendered both deliverables at the same time. And now it's also finished. So I want to finish today with verifying these renders. So I'm now closing the render view. I bring my cursor to the first frame in the timeline and I open Flux Manage. So I go to our renders folder. We can see ProRes 4x4. Here's our file. So we can see it has the correct metadata embedded, and let's show that here in the timeline. And because my cursor is on the first frame, which is also the first frame of the file, I can just simply double click on the file. We still haven't covered color management in depth, but it is good to remember when you check renders, set the stack color space to the input color space. And so now we can compare here on each shot, and we can see that our render looks good. So I delete it from the timeline. And so now let's check our EXR renders. So here we have our date folder, and here we have 3 subdirectories with our desired naming, and inside each one we have the EXR sequences. To insert all at once, I use the descent button. So now I can see all 3. I double click here. So now I have these 3 here below in the timeline, and they will not match to our existing shots because we rendered them without grading. So in order to compare if they look okay, I need to set the rendering of my cursor to bypass all layers. And now we should see, okay, so these frames match. Also note that Baselight automatically picked up the correct input color space from the metadata of the files. So it treats them as ACES linear AP0, which is correct. Okay, so that was all I wanted to show today, and let's see if you have any questions. Yeah, so that was a lot of stuff covered in some time. So let's see if I can see something here in the chat. No, I guess, yeah. I mean, Bob made a nice comment, yeah, because when you're using Baselight Look, then you can't render OpenEXR sequences. But if you're using Baselight Look, then try to render 2 individual H.264 files, for example, or 2 JPEG sequences. Then you would use not a linear color space, but I think that's the same principle is at work. And yeah, and maybe one more thing I just thought about for the Baselight Look people, I want to also give you maybe one hint from my side. So let me just jump back here into Baselight for a moment. So then you render, so let's go to our ProRes preset here. So when you render an MP4 H.264 and you're not happy with the quality, then the important parameter to tweak is that nominal quantizer parameter. So the default is 23, and for my personal taste, that's a little bit too low in quality, but that's the default of the codec. So I think 17 or 18 is a really nice value here. So set it to 17 or 18, and you should get a little bit larger files, but also higher quality. So this is also one of these hints. And also what I forgot to mention during the first part of the demo is that we have a verify render button, which is very helpful. So with the verify render, or maybe I can just click it here. Baselight verifies that all the frames are available, so no offline frames, no missing assets, maybe certain lookup tables used in the stack, etc. And also if it has right permissions to create the files on the destination disk. So for long timelines, this can sometimes take a few minutes to run through to check that every frame is really able to get rendered, but it can save you lots of hassle. So if you want to kick something off in the evening and then come back in the morning. And yeah, so we have a question coming in. Should I check full to legal for H.264 renders? Yeah, typically, as far as I know, the H.264 codec supports both full and legal levels, and we will put the right metadata into the file depending on the video LUT. But I think the most common standard is to render to legal range with full to legal scale to H.264. I once made we have a webinar available also on our webpage, on Vimeo and YouTube. It's called Baselight Q&A, and I made like a 20-minute part in that webinar just about legal and full scaling. So if you're really thinking about how does legal and full scaling work within Baselight, try searching for Baselight Q&A, and then there's a chapter about legal and full video levels. From my point of view, there's not much more to add, or maybe just one more thing. If you got a little bit scared about all these variables in the naming, you don't have to use them during render. You can just type in my nice movie .ProRes or something .mov, and it will also work. But I just wanted to encourage you a little bit working with the powerful features of Baselight, because when you examine the presets that I made, there was nothing project specific built into the preset. So we could use that preset now on any kind of project, and it will always render to a meaningful folder structure and with meaningful parameters, because we know that when people are in the crunch time of a complicated project, the mistakes happen, and the idea would be, or the ideal goal should be, at least from my point of view, to never touch any of these parameters later than in the project, to set it up at the beginning and to find nice things, and that every time we press the button, it will go into a separate file and it will be a meaningful name, etc., etc. So that should be the, I guess, idealistic goal. I know that in reality, it will not always work like that. Yeah, apart from that, Bob, do you have anything to add?
No, thanks. That was a great tutorial, and as you said, we should have that available on our website within the next few days. I would just add, though, that's the fifth and final part of our initial series of 5 videos of covering the Baselight essentials. Next week, we're going to have a break, and the following week, we'll then continue with more free Baselight tutorial videos, continuing with some of the sections from our basic section of our syllabus, looking at some of the individual grading tools. So check back to the training section on our website for details of when these sessions will take place.
Yeah, so then I guess that's all for today. Thanks a lot for watching live and also for the ones watching the video, and see you in the next one. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.